Barn Talk, where the truth takes a stroll. Life's little lessons with a heart full of soul. From sunrise chores to the good Lord's plan, it's Roger's Barn Talk. Pull up, my friend.
Good evening, friends and family. Welcome to another night with Real Barn Talk. Tonight is kind of a real special one for me. I want to sit here and take a little time and give you my testimony. This one probably means more to me than anything that we'll ever talk about. Not that we won't talk about a lot of things that's important and a lot of things that's good and all that, but this particular one is very special to me. And to me is because he gave it to me. And I hope that yours is to you. And I'd love to hear those too. Um, Testimonies is amazing. I tell them, and I said, just learned this recently, and I think I've mentioned it in some of the other recordings that we've done. But the seriousness of your testimony. I tell them, I said, what's the one thing in the Bible that God put in His Word that He thought so much of that He put it in the same sentence with the blood? Says we're known by the word, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. In the same sentence, that means it's pretty important, and it is to me. It's very serious and good. Mine was a roller coaster ride that and probably most everybody's is too. So when I say this kind of stuff, I don't mean to make it sound insignificant to you or to anybody else, but for me it was special. And so I'll get kicked off here, and it's kind of lengthy, so bear with me just a little bit. And I'm just trying to bore you to death, but it's not boring to me. It's I still get excited and I still get emotional when I start telling it because it means that much. But anyway, go back and me and Did married, and I've been raised in church and around the church, and I have a heritage in my family of the church, and I've always believed. It's never been an issue about me not believing. And problem was is that I just didn't think about it. Bottom line, and looking back at it now, it's like I didn't fear things. When we're young, we're invincible, and we think that things just they're going to go, and we just don't think about things like that, and as much as we probably should. Uh, Me, I chased everything in this world. I've chased a dollar. I've chased business. I chased, everything. Anything that was fun, enjoyable, I love to do. Anything to do with hot rods and going fast and pretty cars and boating, and being on the river and riding motorcycles. I just love. I mean, the hobby stuff. I just love it, and it just always was my thing. And so I stayed busy. And I always told everybody, I said, I'll work as hard. I've never been not worked hard, not been, had a job and things of that nature, but I'd always work as hard as it took to get to play. I mean, that was kind of the way I looked at that. I just, and so we played hard. We worked hard, but we played hard and for years. And so that kept my mind occupied and busy and stuff. And so it's frustrating now after you look back at it. It's frustrating that I didn't do this a lot earlier. I didn't seek him earlier when I knew I should, but then didn't. 'Cause man, I missed a lot of good times. When I thought I was having fun and thought I was enjoying, wasn't anything like this. And just getting to do this podcast, just get all geared up for this, as aggravating as some of this stuff has been and trying to do. Um, I'm gonna tell you, when you sit down here and get to talking about the Lord and you get a chance to share with people and then you hear the stories back and the conversations and the phone calls and the text messages and the things like that. I'm gonna tell you, there's nothing like that. And for me, there's nothing like that. I love it and I love sharing the word and I love sharing good stories and even and bad stories. I mean, but because it takes it all. It's but anyway, to get on with my testimony, I chased and done and been all over the country and been all over everywhere. and had my business going, trucking business, and it was running wide open, doing good, was making money. It wasn't nothing like that. It wasn't healthy, family healthy, everybody's doing good. It was nothing like that, and I always tell everybody going into this part of it, um, I always tell people, I said, I said, "He didn't have to take my health or my family or my marriage or my money or anything like that." I said, "That's not how he got my attention. He got my attention by loving me. He loved me, and he knew what it'd take. He put people in my path that changed my life. He put people and it was all over the place. It wasn't just one particular one. He put people and I'd see it, and the more I'd see it, the more attractive it got to me. And what I was seeing was people that was doing things for people. They'd be you go to the grocery store and I happen to be standing behind some people and see somebody pay for somebody's groceries or go in the gas station and be standing there and fix to pay for your gas and somebody paid for the person's gas that was out there and or things of that nature. It was just amazing to me how many times that was happening in different ways. Sitting talking to a guy one day just through work and doing some negotiating on some business stuff, and his phone kept ringing, and this guy was fairly connected, very wealthy man out of Atlanta, and owned a lot of property and a lot of businesses and stuff. But anyway, so his phone the whole time we was there, he was on the phone, off the phone, on the phone, and it was amazing to listen to him talk whenever he'd tell him, say, put them here and put them there and take care of this one and take care of that one. And when he got off the phone, I just had to say, I just said, I don't understand, but I said, whatever it is that you do, I said, it must be really, really gratifying and it must be really good because I said, I've been sitting listening to you talk about how to help people in all these different places. And he said, well, I'm blessed. He said, I've been blessed and he said, and I'm in a position to be able to help people and stuff. And I said, that's really refreshing to me. I said, and I said, it's really speaking to me. I said, because most people don't help other people. They just don't think about it. They don't do it. They just chasing life for themselves and they won't slow down long enough to see somebody in need or maybe somebody that it might help or it's just it's not that they're bad people. It's not that people like it's just that we've got so busy in life and so caught up in what we do that we just don't think about that. And so with him, me and him got to talking about that and it really started speaking to me and he ended up he owned a bunch of stuff in Atlanta, like the Fox and the Roxy, the theaters over there, and he was a promoter in the music world, and it was amazing, the clientele that he had and things like that, um, and it was just amazing how he did and then what he got to do and how blessed he was, and I got a chance to meet him, and it was just stuff like that, people like that come along and really I started seeing it, and the more that was happening, the more attractive it got to me, and so during this time, all this was happening like that, my business was running wide open, we're doing good, I had decided to, some projects I wanted to do, remodel an office and rebuilding a shop, and the last project I got to was I was gonna build a barn. And this barn, I told Dana, I said, "It's my last project for a while. We're gonna slow down on this project stuff and start enjoying some of this," and I said, "But I wanna get this barn up and going." I said, "We've got 3 horses and I got a place I need to keep my race trailers in the wintertime when I'm not racing. I need to get them out of the weather and this now." So the barn had a multiple purpose that I was gonna build, and so she told me, and like most wives, that she said, "Where are you gonna build this barn?" I said, "I'm gonna build it out here behind the house." And she looked at me and she said, "You build something out behind my house that takes away from this place?" She said, "I'm killing you." And I said, "You think I'd do that?" And she said, "Yeah, I do." So anyway, but I didn't. Because I listened to her what she wanted, but I'm joking. But anyway, we go out there and I start building on this barn. And I had an idea of what I wanted and I had run that by her and she liked that part of it. But anyway, we started getting it up and it was amazing because it kind of just everything was just going right on along, doing good, and she had never been out there to it, and so we'd had to go to Nashville to a doctor's appointment, actually, at Vanderbilt, and for her. And on the way home that day, I asked her, I said, I said, tomorrow, I said, I'm gonna get the guys and we're gonna start working on the interior of the barn. I said, we're gonna start on the stalls and the tack room and the bathrooms and stuff like that we're gonna put in there. And I was gonna kind of make a man cave out of it too. And that's what my thought was. She changed all that. But anyway, I said, "You wanna go out and look at it?" And she says, "Yeah, I do." I said, "Sure." We got home before dark, and so we got home and we walked out there where it was at, and I got to the side door, which is the same door that's there now. Anyway, I opened the door and for her, and she walked just to the door and stopped, didn't go in, and I said, she got to looking in there and I could see those wheels turning. And when you live with somebody 40 years, you know kind of what they're thinking when you see the look on their face. And with her, it was definitely, I said, uh-oh. I seen them wheels turning and the creativity in her mind going. I thought, oh, I'm in trouble here. And she said, "Is that 10 foot in between them posts?" And I said, "Yeah." "Why?" And she said, "Okay." And she went on and she was thinking, and then in just a minute, she hadn't went inside the door. She's just standing in the doorway, but she looked over and she pointed across, all the way across, and she said, "That first section right there, that first 10 foot," she said, "I want an arts and craft room." And then she said, "The next 2 sections right there," she said, "I want a full kitchen. And then the next section, I want a bathroom with a shower in it." And then she leaned her head inside and she pointed right down the wall. She said, "I want a stacked rock fireplace right there." I said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "This is a horse barn." He said, "There ain't no more." And needless to say, the next morning, instead of us starting building stalls, we started doing the inside. And it took me a year. A year later, we finished it, and like she wanted it, and it was amazing that year. And I say that in a way that it was probably one of the best years of my life, just to be totally honest with you. We started working on that. I'm not a carpenter per se. I piddle on stuff, but I'm not the carpenter um, that a lot of people are. I'm more out to drive race cars and things of that nature. So, but this thing really got my attention, and so I spent most every evening at night looking at YouTube and how to lay hardwood flooring or how to put in a shower and things like that. And then I get up the next day and I'd done it that way. And so between me and YouTube, we built that barn, and with the Lord's help. But during that, and the reason I say it like this is because the barn plays a big factor in all this. And I knew the whole time we were building this thing and doing it every day, it seemed like something else would happen. Something else, somebody would come by, something would happen, and it would just be out of the normal. And for me anyway, and I would see it or hear it, and I thought, God. And then there was this one day particular. No, there was a bunch of days she did this, but this one particular day, she came out and in the evening after she got off, and I'd be out there working, and Greg would be out there with me a lot of times, and Greg could sing. I can't sing, so she knew better to ask me to do it, but Greg could sing. And so she'd asked him to sing a little bit, and then she'd walk around that barn inside and clap her hands and have him sing a little bit, and she was looking for a sound. I didn't understand all that because I'm not a music person, but she was making, seeing how the echoes and the different sounds and stuff, and I said, "What's your thoughts?" And she said, "I don't know. I can see having singings and things of that nature in here, and I thought, well, that'd be great. That'd be fan. Our daughter sings, and she loved to sing, and then of course Dana loves music, any kind of music. I mean, she'd play anything. So anyway, it really made sense that probably was what we would do, and so I said that night to her, I said, well, I said, there's one that I'd really like to have here, but I said, I know we probably couldn't afford to have him because I said I don't know what his fees are, but I said I'd really like to have him. And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "Jason Crabb." I said, "I'd really like to I'd really like for him to sing here." And she said, "Well, maybe." And then that was the end of it. We didn't talk about it anymore. And probably a month or two later, we were working, and one night I was out there working, and she came out, and here again she was doing her clapping, and it was just me and her out there that night. And like a lot of nights, we'd go out there. I'd work till bedtime every night, just about, and it's just really, it was just really something that I was passionate about, and um and I was putting up stage lights, the lights that's over the stage now out there. And I was up a ladder and putting them lights up, and something was said. And for the second time, I told her, I said, I said, I think about this a lot when you get to my singing. I said, I really, I'd really like to hear him and like to have him here. I said, do you think we could afford that? I said, is it, you think, what do you think it cost? And we neither one knew and nothing about, we had known them, we'd met them a long time ago when they were young and kids, and they're still kids to us, but back when they were really young, they came to our church and did a homecoming, and then we went on a cruise. After that, right after they made it big, we got to go on a cruise that they hosted, and we just had a blast. And so um, and that was it. Hadn't seen him again in 20 years. I mean, 20 years later, and what we're talking about. But we had followed his career and their career, and we loved their music, and I still loved it then, still love it today, and all. But um, anyway, we kind of let that go, and this was winding up, and was just about to finish the barn, and anyway, and we I'm gonna get emotional here because I always believed in anointing, and I've always believed in getting things right. Um, from that standpoint, it's the reason why you dedicate your children when you have babies. You carry them up, have them dedicated, and you give them back to the Lord, because that's whose hands that we want them to be in. Well, I did my business that way too. The trucking business got done that way. The trucks got prayed over and anointed with oil, and handkerchiefs put under the seats, and drivers never knew, but we knew, and God knew, and and it was blessed, and I'm thankful for that. And so that barn was no different. When before we had the first wedding, they were actually people there ready to do a rehearsal, and I wouldn't let it happen. I said, nope, I can't do it yet till my family gets here, and the rest of the family gets here, and Brad and Sean and everybody there, and we got anointed oil, and anointed every doorpost, every post, and every door frame, and everything. And then we hit what we call the altar up there. You make an altar anywhere, but what we call the altar up there now, and at the edge of the stage, and we all start praying, and we dedicated that barn back to the Lord and said, Lord, you have your way. Just do with it what you see fit. You're the one that blessed us with it, and I want to be a good steward of what you blessed us with. So here, this is, and when we got finished, then they went on with their wedding, and practice that night, but then they had their wedding, and then after that, it was every weekend. And a lot of times it was not only weddings in the weekends, but we'd have proms like on Friday night or Thursday night or Friday night, and then weddings on the weekends. And it's like, holy, I mean, 3 years that thing went wide open, and it was just crazy. And but I'm gonna back up here into that. But when we opened the barn, that was in August. We opened it, and I had in March before it opened, we was at a revival at the church we was going to, and a guy named Randy Caldwell came and done a revival, and he was amazing. And he was talking about that day, that about a trip to Israel. He said, I'm going to Israel in November. He said, I go several times a year, but he said, my next one that I have openings, and I only have a couple left. And he said on this particular one, but he said it's going to be at the end of November. So we'll be in Israel for Thanksgiving, and then the week of Thanksgiving through the first week of December, and stuff. And so I didn't ask. I didn't. I normally get in trouble for that, but I didn't ask. I just, I just went up after church and talked to him. I said, I'd like to see about maybe booking two of them going to Israel, and he said, okay. And so I ended up booking two trips to Israel for me and her, and we ended up three of us. There's another gentleman from here in town that went with us and stuff. So it's three of us from that church went. um, on that trip. But, anyway, I told her later that I had done that, and I said, "The reason," because she taught Sunday school our whole marriage. I mean, basically her whole adult life and the youth and things like that. And if you just knowed how much she studied and you people that teach and preach and all, you know exactly what it takes to study and be prepared for that kind of stuff. But he did that, and all of our marriage, she's been like that and dedicated to that, and our kids seen that, and anyway, it's very very good. And so I thought it'd be something nice. So I'm not looking for an attaboy here, but that just thought it would be something nice. We had a big anniversary coming up and that next year, and so I book it and I tell her later, and she got mad at me. She said, "You should have told me. You should have asked me. You should have talked to me because I've just come off a neck surgery and I'm not sure that that I said, then we got a long time before we're talking about a ways out. Anyway, she settled down and we went, and that trip was amazing. I mean, absolutely life-changing, amazing. And you gotta understand the timing and all this. I went to church. I was at church every Sunday, and a lot of the Wednesday nights I was at church and all. But looking back at that time and all that time, prior to that, uh, I didn't have a relationship. I didn't have a moment. I didn't have I believed. It was not a fact of believing or not believing. I believed, but I didn't have a personal relationship with the Lord. In other words, I was playing church. And boy, how many people do that and have done that. And how many people are fooling themselves thinking they're not doing that by saying, "Oh, I don't," you know, is God first in your life? Ask yourself and then really thinking, is he first? Is he? And that's the question I had to ask. Are you? And is he? Well, I'm gonna tell you what. Hang on, he'll show himself to you if you do that, and he did to me, and so But anyway, we went to Israel, and that's gonna be a whole nother podcast. I'm gonna get into that. It'll be a whole nother episode of this stuff. I want to go into all of the Israel trip. It was amazing. But anyway, we went and we spent 14 days, most amazing 14 days, but I ain't never been so tired in my entire life either. 'Cause when we hit the ground running over there and we never checked up. I mean, it was wide open for 14 days. And I wished I could go back right now. I'd crawl on a plane this very second and go back over. Even with all the unrest over there, it really ain't unrest. It is in the news and the propaganda crap that our press gives, and that's what it is crap. But they want us to believe the narratives and all this stuff and have fear. That's how they control everybody. If you just want to know the truth, how they control everything is by using the media and the narratives with the newspapers and all these things. Control because of using fear. If you listen to the news, everything is fear. What happened to the good things? What happened to the good days? What happened to the good things and the everything is negative and bad and wrong. And over there and in the Middle East is, everybody wants to cut everybody's heads off. That's a biggest bunch of crap that we get fed. And I found that out once I went. I learned exactly what propaganda meant and it was real and it's a real thing. And we stood on one observation deck. I'm gonna tell this before I go on. We stood on one observation deck, just kind of overlooking down toward that Gaza Strip that they talk about, and we're in Israel, but you can see that area down in there. And the news had CNN and all of them. I think all of them used the same platform for their TV cameras and stuff. But there was a fence down there, and they talked about how inhumane the Israeli people were because they had this fence and they wouldn't allow the Palestinian people over there to come across. And I'm thinking, and we're looking at this. We're standing on the same observation deck where all these cameras is at, and there's an end to both ends of that fence. I'm talking about just outside of the camera view. That way, there's the end of the fence, and the same way down here. The fence was, I'm going to say, probably roughly 500 yards long. That's a pretty long fence, but there's an end to it, and you just walk down to the end of it, walk around it, and come right on in. It was there and put up for a reason. That's so the Western country, us, could see that and say, and then trying to change the narrative about how bad those people, and that is what a lie. So anyway, so I learned a ton about about Israel and the Bible come alive to me. Two, it showed me what the Pharisees and they're so scared of the truth. That's what's happened, and that's what happened back in the days with when Jesus, yeah, the Pharisees and the religious people back in them days, they was more out and afraid of the truth than they were about what was doing right. So that's why they picked Barabbas. If you think about it, this goes on to today. The same thing. They're still scared of the truth. The truth is the one thing that'll set you free, but they're scared to death of it. So anyway, I didn't mean to get that far into that, but the Israeli, you don't want to miss that episode when we're going to that, because when we went to Israel, it was so amazing the things that we got to do, and we got to go to we got to see the third temple, the construction of that. We got to go to that college where it's at. They've already got it. They've got it, all the walls and all the stuff, like a prefab type thing built. The furniture for the inside the third temple is already finished. And a lot of people don't know all that stuff. It's there. That's how close we are to the end of all this. We've seen it. We got to go to it, and some stuff like that. So don't miss that episode. I'll give a heads up of when we're going to do that one. But you don't want to miss that one, because that was an amazing trip. And stuff. But anyway, let me get back to my testimony, because that was a huge part right there, that we went, and boy, he had already been working with me in the building of the barn, and I need to go back, because there's something that's very important that I left out, and that is really very important. I skipped before we got the building finished, the barn finished. Um, there was a gentleman that we went to church with. There's a lot of good people we went to church with. There's a lot of good folks at that church, and trust me, I loved them all. They were a lot of good people there. Um, but this one gentleman, I had asked him to come, and he put in septic tanks and driveways. He had bulldozers and dump trucks and stuff like that, and I had access to that stuff, but I didn't have time to do all of it. And so I asked him, would he come put my septic tank stuff in? So he did. And so this one particular day, me and Greg's in there working, and we're finishing some trim up around the door. So that's how close we were to finishing it. But anyway, he came, and he was out there, and he digging, and he came around the corner, and we had the front sliding doors open, and was working right there inside the door. And Ricky asked, he said, Roger, he said, could you come out, you and your friend come out and help me? He said, I'm ready to set this tank. And he hadn't been that long. And I said, you're already ready? He said, yeah, I've got it ready. I said, I just need some help. If you could just hold it and line it up to get in, I'll set it in the hole. And I said, absolutely, we'll be right out. And so Greg was up on the scaffolds. I was doing the cutting, and Greg was up on the scaffold. He come down, but me and him had a conversation just minutes before this, where Greg had asked me about praying for his daughter, or not praying for her, but telling me that he just having trouble with her and problems, and 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 he just was really worried about her, and just like you do when you love your children, and I can't remember what I told him. I just know that probably what I told him, was more of a worldly answer than it was a spiritual answer. And it's one of those times when you wish you could have it back and say, Lord, I wished I could have that opportunity back. I would promise you, I would have led him in the way of praying to you, because I know where the answers are at today. But I didn't that day. And it really spoke to me, because we went right out that door. We went out there, and Ricky had everything ready, had it hooked to his machine. All we had to do was stand there and basically guide the thing and just hold it as he picked it up and set it over in the hole. And it's a 1,000-gallon tank, so it's a pretty big tank. We had to go with a bigger tank because of the number of people, and that was going to be able to capacity of the barn and stuff. So it was a big tank. And anyway, we set it, and as he got it in the hole, it sit right down in there, just as pretty. And so me and Greg stepped out on the top of it and was taking the chains off the corners, and Ricky come off his machine and walked down to where we were at on that tank, and we're all three standing on that tank. And he said, that was pretty good. And I said, that was amazing. I said, it did. That wasn't any effort at all of that. And he said, no. And then Greg says to Ricky, he don't know Ricky. He didn't know him. He just knowed what I had told him about him. But he said, sir, he said, Roger tells me he goes to church with you, and he has a lot of faith in you. And he said, could I ask you a favor? And Ricky said, well, of course you can. And he said, I got a daughter that I'm really worried about, concerned about." Said, "She's just into things that she shouldn't be into and doing things that she shouldn't be doing and neglecting her kids a little bit, and I'm worried about that, and just some things like that." And said, "I just don't know what to do." And he said, "I was wondering if maybe tonight before you go to bed, maybe you and your wife, would say a prayer for my daughter." And Ricky said, "Absolutely." He said, "What's your daughter's name?" And he told her and told him, and he said, "Yes." He said, "Absolutely." He said, "Tonight, before me and Rachel go to bed," he said, "we'll call her name out," and he said, "We'll have prayer for her." And, and sure will. And Greg said, "Thank you, that means a lot." And I'm sitting there, I ain't saying, I'm just thinking, man, this was amazing to me how how that did, and so Ricky turns to walk off back to his machine, back to his backhoe, and I'm standing there, me and Greg is, and as Ricky walked away, you could see his head moving, and he was just shaking his head, and it was like, whoa, and just as he started to step off that tank onto where his backhoe is at, he stopped and turned around, and when somebody's looking at you, and then when when somebody's looking in your direction, you think they're looking at you, but they're really not. Well, that's the way he was. He was looking at us, but he wasn't looking at us. He was talking to somebody else, and he was saying, "No, no." And it wasn't much more than probably 3 or 4 steps from where he is at back to us. So just in a second, he's right back in front of us, but he said, "No." And that last one was pretty loud. I mean, "No." And then then he was looking straight at Greg and he said, "No, you had enough to ask me to pray for your daughter." He said, "We're not gonna wait till tonight." He said, "Absolutely not." He grabbed Greg by the hand and he grabbed me by the hand and he started praying. And folks, I'm gonna tell you something. He prayed the prettiest prayer. For me not to be able to tell you one word he said in that prayer, it was the prettiest prayer I ever heard in my life. Because what I saw and what I heard and standing out in the middle of that pasture out next to that barn, I seen something that I had never saw before. I seen a light coming out of him, a bright light out of him. And people say, "You're crazy." Well, you can call me what you want. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know what I saw a light come out of him that was so bright. That was brighter. I tell him all the time, I said, "It was so bright, it was brighter than the sunshine when he's standing in the same light to me." And he prayed for him, holding our hands, and tears was just flying. I mean, it was just one of those moments. And then when he got done, he turned loose of our hands, and he just turned away and went right back and got on his machine, and I'm gonna be honest with you, that spoke to me as much as the other part did, because the Bible talks about that we're supposed to be ready in season and out of season. And what I saw him do that day was I didn't understand it at the time. Now this has took time for this all to come, but it came. What I saw that day was obedience. What I seen that day was Satan would have wanted him to walk on and got on that machine and not done that. But Ricky had a relationship with the Lord in a way that he knew better, and he knew who was trying to push that, and that's the reason he was saying no, and he was shaking it. So I saw obedience in him. I seen him res he fought that, and he came back, and then he prayed, and I'm gonna tell you, it made a difference. It made a difference in my life, for sure, because that spoke to me as much as anything. We walk off, me and Greg both, the tears and we both tears streaming. We get back up to the edge of the barn there, and Ricky's putting the dirt back on the septic tank or pushing that edge and fixing to start doing the fill lines, and it for him, it was like everyday business, if you understand what I'm saying. And us, we're supposed to be like that. We're supposed to be ready when God calls like that. We should be in that position and have ourselves in that position to be ready to answer that call, just like he did. And boy, you talking about speaking to me. And Ricky Carroll is one of out of all the people I know in my walk like that, Ricky Carroll spoke to me about that and taught me that lesson right there. It was so valuable. I love that man dearly and his family and all of them actually. They're just wonderful people. And that but I got back up to the build up to the barn and was fixing to go back in and Greg and I stopped and Greg looked back. He said, "What was that? And what just happened?" I said, "Greg, I don't know. I don't know." I said, "But what I do know I said, "Whatever that was is what I wanna be." I've never felt nothing like that. And I said, "I've never seen nobody do like quite like that." I said, "What was that?" I said, "That's being a difference maker, Greg. That's what he was doing. That's what he was, what he is, and that's what he was doing there." And I said, "That's what I wanna be." And that day, and from there to here, it has been the adventure that I'm fixing to get into, with you that has been amazing. From that moment, the barn had already been things been happening, as I was saying, but it really kinda come to there, and I didn't mean to miss that one because that was one of the most important things, but anyway, so right after that, then the barn started and we started having weddings, and then we got to go to Israel that fall at Thanksgiving, and that was just an amazing thing. We get back home after Christmas and I mean, after Thanksgiving, and my secretary was with the trucking company was pregnant and she was due, pretty close at any time. And so she ended up going off on and having her baby. And so it tied me down in the office. I was sitting in here and if you know me real well, I'm not real good at being tied down and sitting in an office. I like to do that work. I like that. I enjoyed that, but I don't enjoy being tied down and sitting there all day. I like to go between there and the shop and down here to the neighbors, and I like to I like people, and so I like to be around people, and but that particular day, it was wintertime, it was cold, I'm sitting in here, and I'm like, "Okay, I gotta do something," everything was running good as far as the business, I just sitting here bored as much as anything. And, so I got thinking about our anniversary was coming in February, and I thought, "Well, I gotta do something. I mean, I gotta do something nice." I'm not the nicest guy, and I'm always busy with the family and doing I mean, busy with my business, and I'm racing, and every weekend when race season's in, I'm somewhere racing and stuff, and they done never fussed at me about any of that. So it was like, I wanna do something really special for, we just come from Israel, but that ended up being more for me than it was her at the end of the day, and so I thought it was for her, but it was really for me, but, anyway, I was sitting there and got thinking about something to do, and so I just got to looking at different things and pulled up um, JasonCrabb.com and what went on, and then got to looking at it and looking at his schedule, and our anniversary is February the 4th. And so I'm looking on his schedule there, if you ever go to his schedule, you'll see how it's all listed in there anyway. And it showed that it was going to Jason Crab, but it was showing the whole Crab family. And they normally at that time they was doing tours in January. Normally January and February they would do a lot of dates as a family, and that'd be the only time of year they'd do that. And then normally after that it was all everybody went and done their individual stuff. But that particular time they was all the family. And so on February the 4th, God has it, He orchestrates everything. So, and I believe that. But it goes to prove that on February the 4th, they were gonna be in Gadsden, Alabama at the Tabernacle down there, big church in Gadsden. I thought, "What's the chances that they're gonna be on our anniversary?" They're down and so I go and I call no, I go online to, his booking agency there, and I started trying to do and put in and get tickets. I wanted to get the tickets, and I wanted to get, meet and greet and that kinda stuff, and I I put my credit card in and my number on there, and it wouldn't take it, and I thought, "Damn, they not know my credit card." I mean, it's nothing wrong with it, but it wouldn't take it. So I just call them. I thought, I'd rather talk to them anyway. I don't like to do that kinda stuff like that. I just rather talk, and, so I call and they answer, and there was a lady, and I was telling her who it was, and I said, I'm trying to get tickets to this, Crab family night in Gadsden, Alabama," and she said, "Yeah." I said, I've been trying to put my credit card in," and she said, "It's messed up. It's something online, and it's not letting the credit cards go through." And I said, "Well, I knew something was up." I said, "Just didn't know what." Well, anyway, me and her strike up a conversation, and we get to talking, and before long, I told her that story about building the barn and having and one name had been mentioned twice about being singing in the barn. Only one name twice. And she said, "Well, that probably could happen." And I said, "I doubt it." I said, I don't know." I said, It costs a lot of money, to get him." And she said, "Well, how big is your venue?" And she started asking me all these questions and about seating and all this stuff. And she was putting the logistics to stuff, the stuff that I did every day with my trucking company. She was putting it together for him and all that. And I thought, man, this is anyway. And and so she said, "I'll tell you what, because it being a little smaller of a venue," she said, "what we need to do is catch him on a date." She said, "Jason's only one, and if you know him, you'll know what I'm talking about." This is what she told me. She said, "Jason's the kind of person that he would rather stop and play someplace for less money." 'Cause she said, "'Cause in all reality, it's not all about money to him." She said he'd rather stop and play as he had to drive by. And he said most of them, they don't make their minimum. They just drive by and go on and not do anything. And he's not that way. Well, well, what's the truth? I mean, if there've ever been anybody said the truth, she did that day because it's exactly who he is. He's anyway. But anyway, we got to looking and we went ahead and got my tickets for that fourth for sure. I had got that locked down, and then but before I got off the phone with her, I had him booked in our barn on the 17th day of February, which was just 2 weeks later. And he's going to be in Birmingham on a Friday night. And he didn't have anything booked on the Saturday. And he was going to the Cove in Asheville, North Carolina, which was Billy Graham's church, for Sunday night, Sunday morning, and then Sunday night. He had two that day. He was going to be actually going to be preaching on Sunday morning and speaking and then singing that night. And so she said, "What we need to do is make them an offer." She said, I said, "Well, I'm just gonna be honest with you." I said, "This ain't about money to me." I said, "I don't have to make a dime." I said, "I don't want to take a bath in it." I said, because I don't know what I'm doing with this, but I said, and she said, "Well, how much?" And anyway, we got to come up with a number, and I thought, "I'll pay that out of my and not charge anybody." I said, "I could, if he would." She said, "All we can do is throw it at them and see what they say." And so we did, and I mean, within a few minutes, I get a message back or call back from her, and she said, "They accepted your offer." Said, "He's booked for the 17th, that Saturday night." I said, "You're kidding me." And she said, "Nope." And I'm just all of a sudden getting plumb excited. I mean, this is gonna be awesome, And so I called Dana. I said, "You ain't gonna believe what I've done." And honestly, I thought she's gonna kill me again because I she said, "Do you know what you have just done?" And I said, "Well, I thought I was doing something good." And she said, "You did." But she said, "Do you know how hard it's gonna be to get things together and prepared and tickets and all this kind of stuff done?" She said, "We got from now, this is in December, we've got till February the 17th, 2 months, basically 2 months to get this together." I thought, "Well, I thought we could do it in 2 weeks." Well, I'm way wrong about that. 'Cause we gotta complicate everything. We're gonna make it. We're gonna make it good, if we can. And I'm gonna tell you, um, what a an experience. But anyway, I don't mean to bore you with this, but this is real because this is where the rubber started meeting the road for me. Um, we go to Gadsden on on the 4th on our anniversary. We went out and eat, and then we went on to that meet and greet. We got a little bit we was in there just a little bit late, and so we kinda sit to the back of the meet and greet, and that all the kids, all the crap family was up there, and they doing their questions and answers and laughing, and it was good. They make you feel so home and at home and comfortable, and they just love everybody and everybody's family, and you just I love that about them. I mean, that's just it's a draw, I just love that, and so anyway, we had a great night. I mean, that was probably as good an anniversary as you could have asked for, to have been in that and eaten and all. So after it's over, and any of you that know, and most of you that know me have heard him, or people that hadn't. But anytime that Jason does a concert like that, and or the Crab family is all, they always go out and meet the people. After it's over, they'll go into the lobby or wherever they have a place to set them up. I've been with Jason many times since then, many times, by driving his bus or been with him or we go a lot of places, okay? And I've never been anywhere that he didn't stay and meet and shake hands, sign an autograph, take a picture with any and everybody that wanted one. I've never seen him say no to nobody like that. I've never heard him. I mean, there's things that he won't do that's not proper. I mean, that I've seen people ask him to do, and like signing, somebody's shirt in a improper places, and he won't do it. Now, and I respect that and all. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that's who he is, and I love that about him. I love that humbleness and that um approachability, I guess, is the word I want to use, because not everybody in that position that has that kind of platform is approachable. And I learned from that that you want to be a difference maker in somebody's life, a true difference maker, you got to be approachable, and you got to make yourself approachable, because if you're not, then people are never going to have that feeling that they can come to you and have that genuine feeling that you have their best interest at heart when they're asking you these personal things and stuff. And Jason's one of those that, I mean, he just y'all know the ones that you know him, he's personal. He makes it personal. And I love that about him. And really, I want to be like that. I want to be like Ricky Carroll. I want to be that in season, out of season guy like that. But you kind of see the pattern that God was putting these people in my path, and I was seeing it, and it was so attractive to me that the way they were doing, and the way that all was coming about, and God was doing that for me, and I could feel it. I could feel it. But anyway, I but I hadn't been to a point that I was on my knees and asking and trying to seek that. I was just he was working on me. I guess as Jason sings that song about he was working on a building, he was working on a building with me, because I mean, I can see that and feel it now and can talk about it. Um, anyway, that night we go out into the lobby, and we're waiting, and gonna say hi to him. And like I said, we had been on a cruise with him, and me and him had a moment back then. And Dana said, "You think he'll remember?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I don't think so." I said, "It's been 20 years." I said, "He won't even know who we are." And 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 she said, "You're probably right." So we're standing in this line, and I mean, it's long, and then it finally dwindles down, and I'm gonna say there's probably 15, 18 women and people, but most of them were women, but was in front of us. And he kept looking at me from even before that. But he'd sign autograph or talk, take pictures, and then he'd look up and he'd see me, and he'd go back to doing what he's doing. And Dana's catching that, and then she'd say, "He's trying to figure out who you are, because he remembers." I said, I doubt it." Then it's been over 20 years. I said, "I doubt it." And anyway, we get up there, and like I said, it's probably, I don't know, 10, 12, 15. I don't know how many ladies. There was a few in between us, and he was finished signing an autograph and handed it to the lady and took a picture with her. And he looked at the next lady, and he said, "If you don't mind, give me just a second." And she said, and he looked up and pointed at me, and he said, "Who are you?" He said, "I know who you are," but he said, "I cannot place it to save my life." He said, "And it's been worrying me for the last 30 minutes. I've seen you." And he said, "But I can't place you." And, and I said, "Well," I said, "could give you 2 hints." And I said, "You probably would remember." And he said, "I like that." He said, "All right, I'm ready. What's the first one?" And I said, "The big red boat." And he said, "Oh my gosh." He said, "That's been a long time ago." I said, "Yeah." I said, "It sure has." I said, "It don't even exist anymore." He said, "I didn't know that." I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's long gone." I said, he said, "All right, what's my second one? What's my second clue?" And I said, "The second clue is parasailing." And folks, I'm gonna tell you, I thought he was gonna bust a gut. He started laughing and choking up and cracking up, and looked back. He said, "That's you." He said, "I," then he starts looking at these women, and he said, "Y'all," he said, "I've never seen a grown man cry, whine, and pray like I seen that man right there do on a parasail." And I said, "But Jason," I said, "you remember what we were sitting on? I told you when we were sitting up there. We're 600 foot off the ground, behind a boat, off the water." I said, in the Bahamas, and I said, "We're sitting on kite string." And I'm a pretty big boy. And and he said, "I ain't never heard nobody pray like." He said, "That is you." He said, "I wouldn't have thought about that." He said, and I said, "Yeah, that was me." He said, "Oh my goodness." He said, "You stand right there. Just give me just a minute." And so he went on and took care of those ladies in front of us and was really nice and didn't rush a one of them. He did not a one. But then he got up to us, and me and Dana stepped up there, and there's a line behind us too. There was still a big line of people, but anyway, he grabbed me and hugged me and Dana and loved on us, and he said, "Man, I wouldn't have thought about that." He said, "That was fun." He said, "That's been years ago." I said, "Yeah, I've been a long time ago." And anyway, and I said, "Today's our anniversary." And I said, "We just going to come," and I said, "This is a been a great night, a great day." And I said, "Got other news for you too." I said, "We have a barn that we have at our house," and he said, I said, "You in 2 weeks from now, the 17th of this month, you're gonna be, with us at the barn." He said, "I seen something on my schedule," and he said, "Something about a blue pond or a blue something," and he said, I said, "It's the barn at Blue Pond." He said, "That's it." He said, "That's y'all's." I said, "Yes, sir, it is." He said, "I'm gonna tell you what we're gonna do." He said, "We're gonna make that date special." He said, "We'll make that date special." And I said, "Well, we're looking forward to it. We got things together. We got all the riders done. We got everything done that they wanted us to get done. Now we're just trying to get, everything prepared for people and stuff." And he said, "It's going to be great." He said, "We'll have a blast." And then we said our byes and we left. 17th came and they pull up and my wife has got things decked out. It was beautiful down there. And we just couldn't wait. I mean, it was so exciting and everything. And all the band gets off the bus, and Dana babied them all day long, every one of them, all day long. She fed them, and she mamaed that bunch. They were spoiled rotten. I'm just saying, they was rotten. But Jason never got off the bus all day, all day. Seen him that morning. Let me back up. I seen him that morning when they got there. He came to the door and he said, "I'll be out in a little bit." He's like, "I've got some business I got to take care of." But he said, I'll be out in a little. That was early. But then he never come off the bus basically all day. And which is okay. That was not a big deal. And that ain't normally like him, but I didn't know that at the time. I do now, but I didn't know it then. But anyway, we're uh, we're in the barn. The place is packed with people. I'm talking about they showed up and that place was packed. You couldn't put them no more in there. They was wrapped around the walls and the doors open and everything else and the front and anyway, Terry, his road manager, tells me, he said, "Jason's ready to come out if you can go get him." I said, "Absolutely." And so I parked his bus up at my house because at that time everything was still pretty new out there and I was worried about the ground and so we wouldn't bring the bus out there at that time. We do now, but we didn't back then. And and so um I go around and I get him and he gets in the vehicle and he said, "Roger," he said, "I'm so sorry." He said, "I need for you to forgive me." I said, "For what?" I said, "Man, I'm glad you're here." He said, "No, I meant to be out and us hang out and all of us loafer and just get to spend the day together." But he said, I've wrote a series of books, children's books." And he said, "I've been on the phone all day." He said, "Every time I turn around, I'm trying to get it and I'll call you back." And he said, "I've been on the phone with my publisher on that all day, off and on, all day long." And he said, "I've just not been able to get to where I could turn loose." And I said, "It's okay, Jason." I said, "Don't worry about it." I said, "We're all good." I said, "Man, this place is packed and they are ready for a concert." I said, "They're ready." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what," he said, "it's gonna be good." He said, "It is gonna be good." And he said, "I just feel it." And he said, "And I love you." And it was before dark. And he said, "I love your place here." He said, "This is beautiful." I said, "Well, thank you." I said, "It's just a work in progress around here." But I said, "We do weddings and things of that nature here." And he said, "It's very pretty." I said, "Well, thank you." And so we're easing around and about halfway out to the barn. It's not that far, but just a little ways out there. But we're driving around there and he said, "I need to ask you something." He said, "Me and my brothers are going to have a men's conference in the Smoky Mountains in March." And he said, "I'd really like to ask you to go with me if you would go with me and as my special guest." He said, "I'd really like for you to go." He said, "It's going to be really something special up there." And here I am, I'm that crazy guy that owns a trucking company and thinks that I can't get away and nothing can happen without me, and so I kinda blowed it off. I said, Jason, I said, I'd love to, but I said, I don't know that I can get away." He said, "Well, just think about it." And he just, he didn't put no pressure on me. He just take, he just, "You think about it." And he said, "I'd really like for you to go." And I said, "Well, I will. I'll think about it." So we get out to the barn and we're walking to that same door that Dana, the same one, walked to this, and almost, I tell him, I said, almost staying in the same footprints. Because when I opened that door, that place was packed with people. I'm talking about slam packed with people. It was everywhere. And and he stopped in that door, same place she did, and just stopped and looked in there and was just looking around and then he looked back at me and he said something to me that I haven't ever forgot. And it really has became very important to me. He said, "I feel liberty." He said, I said, "That's good." I said, "You," he said, "No." He said, "I feel liberty in this house." He said, "We're not gonna have a concert tonight." He said, "We fixed to have church." I said, "Man, that's exciting to me." I said, "You just have your way, whatever you wanna do." And then we went on in. And so we went on inside and got around, took him to the room over there where he was gonna do the meet and greet with the people, and he was doing that. And about middle ways of that, it was a kind of a lull between 2 families. We're waiting on a dad to get there, and he hadn't come in yet. And so there was just me and him and Dana standing in this room at that very moment. And he said, "I wasn't kidding about what I asked you out there a while ago." He said, "I really I really feel like there's something for you in that mountain there." He said, "I don't know what it is. I can't put my hand on it," but he said, "I'd really like for you to go with me. So I really want you to think about it." Well, that's the first time Dana had heard it. She said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, me and my brothers are doing a men's conference and I want Roger to go with me." Well, it wouldn't have mattered what I'd have said at that point. I was going to that mountain one way or the other because my wife's gonna see to it, but I didn't know it at that moment. But you know how that goes. And um, soon as she knew, it was on. But God had other plans, the way He works it. But anyway, Jason went out, and I told him that little story. I had a chance to tell him the little story about the one name 2 times. I said, "We dreamed about this." I said, "'Cause we weren't sure we could ever do anything like this, and we followed your music all these years and see you on TV and TBN and all the different things all the time, and it was like, but we've always loved your music and loved your heart and the families and all." And I said, "So we just always said that, could you imagine?" He said, "Well, I'm gonna tell you what." He said, "You see that mine?" He said, "It's fixing to happen here just in just a few minutes. That what you talked about's fixing to happen." He said, "So don't ever think there ain't nothing too big for God." He said, "There ain't nothing too big for Him." I said, "I agree with that. I do." And sure enough, he walked out there, and I'm gonna tell you, it was on. From the time he walked out until that night was over. I mean, and it wasn't a concert. If you wanna know the truth, he probably talked as much spoke as much as he did sing. I mean, he'd sing and then he would speak, and people were giving their life to the Lord that night in that barn. And that was the first time that had happened that we knew of. And we didn't even know the significance of it as much that particular night as much as we did got to hear it after the fact. After, we got to hearing from different families and different people about being there that night and what it had meant and what it had done in their family and things like that. And you thought, man, you just got plumb excited about that. But anyway, that night wound up and we went back to the back after it was over and he stood back there. And when the night was finished, it was about 12 o'clock. The last two people to walk out the barn that night was me and him. I opened that same door and he walked out and I walked out, turning the lights out behind him. And we walked out. He stayed there till the last person wanted to shake his hand. Now that place was wrapped around the people in line wanting to meet him and talk to him. And he never rushed the first one. And so we go and we start walking across the backyard and he changed my world now, y'all. He gets about halfway across the yard and he stops, and it's a beautiful night out. And he said, "Man, I love your place here." He said, "This feels like home here." He said, "I love this." And I said, "Well," he said, "I love tonight. Thank you for having this and doing this." And I said, "Hey, you're welcome here anytime. I said, you want to use this barn? I said, it's your, you just use it whenever you want to for, I said, this is what we built this for, is things like this. And I said, anyway, so we walked on and went on out and to the back of the house there and then around to the side where the bus was parked and the band was out there and Dana had been out there with them and everybody said bye and was hugging and saying their byes and they had the bus loaded. They had all already had it loaded and was waiting on him was what they were doing. And they had to be in Asheville, North Carolina the next morning at 9:30. It was 8:30 our time, and this was after midnight, and we're still in the front yard or my driveway at my place, and the bus driver, he was having a stroke. Man, we got to go. Let's go. And Jason said, "We'll go when it's time." He said, and anyway, everybody said bye, and everybody hugged and shook hands and done all the things and Jason's standing there at the end and tell all this all the time. I said, for men, a lot of times men will hug, but they don't hug like, you know, it's a hug, but and I learned something that night that, you know, I had never been hugged quite like that before. He hugged me and when he did, he put his head on my shoulder and he said, "Thank you for tonight. Thank you for this. And thank you for tonight." And I said, "Man, yes." I said, "Thank you for being," you know. And he turned and walked and got on the bus and started up his steps and he got to the top step and he stopped, come back down the steps, didn't get off the bus. He just come to the bottom, got tears running down his cheeks, and he said, "I can't leave." He said, "The Lord ain't letting me leave." He said, "Until you tell me that you'll be in that mountain." He said, "There's something there for you." He said, "I don't know what it is," but he said, "There's something there." And he said, "I can't leave here until you tell me that you'll be there." And I said, "Jason," I said, "they ain't 1,000 horses keep me out of that mountain." I said, "That don't," I said, "I'm not a very smart man," but I said, "I'm smarter than that." I said, "A man don't tell me 3 times, 3 times." I said, "I'm smarter than that." I said, "I'll be there." I said, "You count on it." I said, "The 5th of March, I'll be in Pigeon Forge at that place." And he said, "I'll see you there." And he went on the bus and left. And there's way more. There's a lot more in this. I'm trying to be brief with every bit of this because it's way deeper than all that. But that's what he did. And so we leave, and he leaves, and so we go, and March gets here, and we head up to the mountains, and we carry our motor home up there. And Dana goes with me, and my preacher and his wife at the time, the church I was going to at the time, him and his wife went, and and me and him went over a little early and we walked in this big lodge. It was in a lodge is where it was at. And it was amazing because it was not kind of what I was expecting. I guess when a bunch of men and it being a church thing, you'd have thought that, but there was a real cliquish at that point. And I thought, man, I said, who came with who was kind of who was talking to one another. It was not like everybody was socializing as a whole at that very moment. And I noticed that and I thought, hmm, I and so we go on and we go sit down at this table, just me and him, and we're sitting there, and in a minute the door opened, and this guy come in the door, and when he come in, you could tell he was limping, waddling. That's what I called it because he was hurting, and he was hurting really bad, and you could tell he was hurting. And then right behind him was a younger man. Well, he walks in and he don't look at nobody. I mean, he don't come in and socialize with anybody. He just comes in, makes a right hand turn like we did, and walks straight down past 2 empty tables and come to the table where me and my preacher was sitting. And he says, "Anybody sitting with y'all?" I said, "No." And he said, "Was our me and my son sit with you?" And I said, "Absolutely." And so they sit down there, and so we start introducing, and they tell us that who they were, and they were from West Virginia, and we told them we was from Alabama and stuff, and this guy says, "I'm here because I was told to come." He said, "I got to have a miracle." He said, "If I don't get my miracle," he said, he says, "That's just where I had to get it. I've got to have it because if I don't, they're fixing to amputate my legs, both of them, from the knee down." And so Case asked him, said, "What's up?" And he said, "I got sugar real bad." And he said, "And it's really bad, and they fixed to amputate my legs." And so I was told that I would find my miracle in this mountain. So my ears go straight up because I'm sitting there and I'm not saying anything at this point. Kate's was doing most of the talking. The preacher was talking. And so I hadn't said anything. I just kind of sitting there but my ears was standing straight up because I was told there's something in that mountain for me too. And, uh, and this man's sitting there saying, and Kate said, well, you're in the right place. If you, and he said, I just drove 8.5 hours. He said, and rode in a car. I didn't drive. He said, but I rode 8.5 hours in a car to be here. And he said, I come with expectations of getting my miracle. And so, well, it wasn't much after that, just minutes after that, that he said that Jason walks in and he walked straight over and straight to the table and he grabbed me and hugged me and he said, I knew you'd be here. I said, I told you I'd be here. He said, I knew it, but he said, I've had you on my mind and had all this on my mind. He said, there's something about this mountain at that. He said, save me a seat right here. He said, I got to go up here and play some music and get this thing started. And he said, I'll be back. And I said, okay. And so at this point, the thing kicked off and man, it was good. That first night was amazing. It was great actually. Um, but nothing happened for that man that night. There was nothing. It was real motivational, and it was as much as anything you'd ever want to be at for a men's meeting. But nothing happened for that man that night, and he didn't say anything. He didn't act disappointed. And I didn't really think much about it at that point either. I really didn't think about it much at all till the next night. But anyway, we go and we break for the night, and then coming back the next day for breakfast, and we ate breakfast there, and had a service that morning, and all the crab boys cooked breakfast for everybody, and it was really neat, and we had a really good breakfast, and there's something over 100 men there, so it's a pretty good crowd, and I'll get to that in a minute. But um, anyway, we have our meeting that morning, and it was good. And then we break again for the afternoon, and so the afternoon was free for everybody to go be with. And so um, we cut out and we go back to the campers, my camper, and got my wife, and we went and loafed a little bit, and then came back that night service, and and Jason wasn't there, and um, And this man that had the bad legs, he wasn't there for the morning service, but then here he came, opened the door, and here he came, and his son rolling him in a wheelchair, and he could still walk, okay, but it hurt to walk. And so his son says, "I found this wheelchair in the cabin we're staying in," and he said, it just made things a lot easier." I said, "Yeah, I can see that." And he said, "Yeah." And that man says, then he says, "Yeah, but I'm here." He said, "I'm standing on what I was promised. I was promised a miracle." And I said, "I'm standing on that, believing nothing less." And, uh, and so anyway, the night starts and don't know what happened to Jason at that very moment. I said, he just wasn't there. And Aaron, that night, Aaron Crabb preached. And if you had never heard him preach, oh my goodness. I mean, that man can preach a paint off a wall, and he's one of the most anointed people I've ever been around as far as preaching goes. And um, that he starts and he's preaching, and I'm gonna be honest with you. Um, I tell him, I said, for all my Pentecostal friends, I said he was slobber knocking. I'm talking about he was bouncing it off every wall, and it was amazing, and it was awesome. You just had to be there and be in the midst of all that. But then he done something that I had never saw before, and it changed my world, and my days have never been the same. Um, Ever, and won't never be because of what happened. But he stopped preaching, just like you took and put a knife through hot butter, and he just stopped. And he stood there just a minute, and he said, "I don't know who you are. I don't know what your need is." And he said, "But it doesn't matter what I know." He said, "It's what he says." And he says, "It's time," like that. And he put that message back together again, just slick, like he never missed a syllable. Went right back to preaching just like he was a minute before. This boy jumps up beside of me, grabs his dad with his wheelchair, and here he goes heading to the front. And y'all, I've sat 2 nights in a row listening to this man prophesy or testify, telling us what he was there for, and 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 really to the point of why he was there, and what he was not going home without, and 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 he was blunt about it. And here they go up to the front, and it was amazing because there's a lot of men there, and we're kind of toward the back, and it just like everybody started parting, and there he went right up to where Aaron was at, and up to the front there, and Aaron preached on for just a little bit, and then he stopped right over by that guy, and he looked at him and he said, "I don't know who you are, and I don't know what your need is. Here again, it doesn't matter what I know. It's just what he says and what this word says." And then he looks at all of us and he said, "Do you know how many people?" And he emphasized the word people, and that was important to me because he said, "How many people were in the upper room on the day of Pentecost?" He said, "On that day, there was 120 people in that room." He said, "Do you know how many men's in this room tonight?" He said, "Today at lunch," he said, "Blaine Johnson had a death in the family." And he said, "That's Jason's piano player. Y'all all know Blaine." And of course, y'all know him too. Blaine's an amazing man and a great talent. Um, anyway, he had a death in his family, and so him and Jason had to go back to Nashville and back, and so they weren't there. He said when they left today, he said that left exactly to the man in this room right now, 120 men. He said that's not by chance. He said, "I don't believe in chance. Don't believe in happenstance. Don't believe in none of that." He said, "I believe it's every bit orchestrated." He said, "I don't know this man. Don't know what his needs are, but it doesn't matter." He said, "This word says," and that's what we're going to do. This word says that we're going to lay hands and pray and anoint this man with oil, and we're going to pray for him, and we're going to believe whatever that is he's needing, that God will meet that. God knows and he knows, but it doesn't matter so long as that we have the faith. We're two or three, and we all know that and know these scriptures and stuff. Well, we standing there, and I'm gonna tell you, um, it was amazing in that room. And just Aaron got his anointing oil out of his pocket and little bottle he had, and he anointed that man with oil. Started praying for him, and all the men in that room started praying, including this one. I wasn't sure my prayers would get past the ceiling. I wasn't sure, but I prayed them anyway. And I'd heard that man 2 nights in a row. I seen how he walked. I seen the pain he was in. I knew what he was there for, and I was praying for him, and as hard as I knew how to. I didn't know, just didn't know how to as well probably as a lot of people do, but I was doing the best I knew how. But, I saw that night, these 2 eyes right here, and I saw with my own 2 eyes, I seen that man's legs get healed right there in front of us. I seen that man come up out of that wheelchair. Of course, he could walk prior to it. It wasn't that he come up out because he was lame. He was lame because he was hurting and his legs swelled. Y'all seen people with sugar. You've seen the black and the red and and the pain and they're just violent, how they feel. Um, that's the way this man's legs, but he come out of that wheelchair and tell everybody this all the time that spiritually speaking, he was in the rafters of that place. Now, not physically, but spiritually, this man was topping trees. And I'm gonna tell you what, place fell on the floor. I don't know how you'd explain that. It was such an amazing thing that happened that night in front of all of us. And it was God's way of showing all of us and showing him, but it was being a witness to us. And I tell everybody, I said, I didn't know that night the whole series. I didn't know the whole story. I didn't know all of it. I just didn't. It took a long time, and God's just give it to me and in preaching in different places that we've been and different things that I've done. You know how the word will come alive to you in different ways and stuff, and it has over this course of time. It wasn't an instant thing, but that night was instant. But for me, you know, I left there and it was late. I'm talking about way late for the really composure come back into place. There was a heaviness come in that room, um, like I had never experienced before. And I didn't know that that heaviness, except the only thing I had really to compare it to was the day standing on that septic tank. if you wanna know the truth. That it was the same that same it was the same feeling in here. I just knew it was something bigger than us and something bigger than, and I didn't know, I didn't understand all of it, but it was changing my life. Anyway, but it was late that night and we finally left and I got back to my motor home and my wife was still awake and it was late. We're talking about after midnight and I walk in and she said, "Well, how did it go tonight?" And I didn't know what to say. I just said, "It went good." I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know. I was trying to make sense of all of it. You know how we do. We always try to get our mind wrapped around what we think what we just saw. And some things you just can't explain. You just can't, or at least when you're like I was, I couldn't explain all that. I can now, but I couldn't then. And so anyway, I laid there. I didn't sleep any all night. I was just laid there all night long trying to make sense of what was all and it was all hitting me back about the barn and how the different things that's happening, the people prior to that, all the and boy, he was working on me that night. And and the next morning when we got up and went and met to eat and eat breakfast and with the preacher and his wife, and as we walked up and he says to my wife, he said, "Roger tell you about last night?" And he said, he didn't say anything other than it was good. And he looked at me and he said, "You didn't tell her about last night?" I said, "I didn't know what to tell her." I said, "I do now, but I said, but I didn't then." I said, "I don't know exactly how many miracles happened last night." I said, "But I know for a fact that there was 2." And he said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "One was for the man and his legs." I said, "That was obvious. We saw it." I said, "That second one was for me." I said, it took me all night to figure that out. That miracle he did it for me." I said, "And I'm gonna tell you," I said, "He changed my world, and it's still changing my world. It still affected me every day of my life." Because I tell it like this, um, I didn't know how to explain it, to a lot of people, but I do now. And when you hear stories in the Bible and things like that, I always tell people, said, "Well, which one of the disciples do you do you line up with more?" And I said, "I'm probably as crazy as Peter." But I said, "In all reality," I said, "I'm more like Thomas." I said, "Thomas got labeled as a doubter and a doubting Thomas." And I see it a little different. The way I read it and the way I understand it, Thomas was a man that was just a plain simple wanting understanding about things. So you explain it to him and tell him and show him, and then he was good. But other than that, just taking somebody's word for it, just because they say it, he didn't take it so much at face value. And I said, so he got labeled as a doubter. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I was like that a whole lot too. I said, but the night that after he got, he came back and was risen, and he came back and he spent 40 days on this earth working on his disciples, lining them up to lead out and to minister to this world. So me and you would understand a lot more and stuff. And but the one thing he did that was such an amazing thing that stuck out to me, and that's how it fed me, was he said, "Bring Thomas to me." And from what I understand the scriptures to say is Thomas came in there and he said, "Thomas, let me see your hand." And he took Thomas by the hand and he took Thomas's finger and he let him rub them nail scars. And then the scripture says that he opened his garment and he stuck Thomas's hand in that pierced side. The night that man's legs got healed, what I the experience I had that night is that's the night he let me touch the nail scars. That's how serious I took that, and that's how serious I still take that. Um, it was life changing for me, and it's still life changing, and it will always be because he made that personal. He made that personal for me, and he'll do that for you too. That's the promise. If you'll seek him, I promise you, he'll show himself to you just the same way. He's no respected person. He's not. He will. And I don't mean to get so heavy, but my testimony is huge to me, and that's what he did for me. Um, the next day, the next day, we're in Pigeon Forge, and we was gonna stay the rest of that week and spend this vacation while we was up there in the motorhome, and I get a call on the phone from a man that I hadn't talked to since November or December, which we had met him in Israel. And he said, "Rodri," and I was walking around the campground just trying to get sense about everything, and he said, "Rodri," he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "You wouldn't believe it if I told you." I said, You just wouldn't believe all this." He said, "Well," he said, "I'm glad you answered." He said, "Because," he said, "I've had you on my mind and my heart." He said, "Randy Caldwell's gonna be at the Alba House in Hickson, Tennessee tonight." And he said, "I just had it on my heart and my mind." He said, "There's something there for you." He said, "I think you need to be there tonight." I said, "What time does it start?" And he said, 7 o'clock. I said, "I'll see you at 7." I come back to the camper. I tell Dana, I said, "Let's go. We're leaving." I went by the office first and I said, "Can I leave my motor home up here?" And I said, "My wife, we're coming back to a conference in 30 days." I said, "I want, how much is it?" She said, $10 a day because it's off season. And she said, "It's off season." And she said, "Just leave it hooked up." And she said, "I'm here every day." I said, "For $300." I said, "I can't even drive it home and back for $300." I said, "I'm just going to leave it up here if you don't mind." She said, "Oh, it'd be fine." And I don't leave my motorhome, to be honest with you. I just never did, but I did that week. We jumped in the car and she said, "Where are we going?" And I told her the story of what Tom had called and from Israel, and a call from, he lives here, but we had met him in Israel. And he said that Randy's going to be preaching at the Abba House, and he felt like there was something there for me. And so we get there, and man, it was packed. There's 1,000 people in there that night. It was full. I mean, it was amazing. We're on the fourth row, and about middle ways is the fourth row, and Randy's got the preaching, and I mean, he was reading my mail. You've all been in services where you hear a preacher preaching and he's reading your mail, and he's reading your mail. Well, that was kind of where I was at. And he said, "You've been putting up with this, you've been talked about and put down. Never felt like you was good enough for 4 decades, 40 years. You've been like this." And he said, and he put his fingers in the air, and he put 40 years, 4 decades. He said, "All that can end tonight," because he said, "You are worthy." He said, "All you got to do is have a repentant heart." He said, 40 years, y'all. I all but knocked my wife down. I hit that altar, I hit that aisle, and I run. I hit that aisle and hit that altar, and I started praying, and I asked the Lord to forgive me that night with as sincere a heart as I've ever had in my entire life for anything. And because I knew what was going on, I knew at this point that I had run as far as I was going to run, and I had questioned way too much, way too long, And there's a reason for all this, and I'm not going to run from it no more. And I asked him to forgive me and to come into my life and be the ruler of my life and Dick, And I tell everybody, I said, when I stood up that day, I said I stood up and it felt like he had his arm around me, just like a friend would do. And I said, in them bad days, it seems like he pulls up a little title. I said, I think, man, thank you, Lord, for that. Had never felt that in my life prior to that day. I had never felt that that security of that. And I'm gonna tell you, man. So my son the other day was talking about some business stuff and some different things, and he asked my advice about it. And I told him, I said, "Son," I said, I've learned one thing." I said, "I learned every decision I make now, I try to measure it to the point. I don't want to make a decision that would ever cause God to pull his favor back. That hand of favor, that hand of protection, that hand of favor that you feel, being able to do this podcast, being able to talk to you people, have y'all as my friends and family, that that's God's favor. That's God's hand on all of this. And I can't imagine doing anything that would cause him to pull his hand in that favor back. And that's what I told Shauna. I said, we got to make sure that every decision we make sure he's out front of it, and then he'll lead us. All he wants us to be is to say yes, be the one that will say, yes, I'll do that. Just like the man on the septic tank that day. And that's what this podcast is about. That's what the barn was about. That's what the tent revival was about. And tomorrow, I don't know what tomorrow holds, but whatever it's going to be, it'll be because he led it somehow. Um, 'Cause my prayer is, Lord, I just I wanna be a difference maker, and I can't be that without you, and I said, so from there to here and all and Jason in our life, I tell everybody all the time, and he'll see this, and he's gonna be here with us, and we'll be talking about a lot of this back then. I tell him all the time, we have went everywhere in this. He's carried us places and introduced us to people that we'd never would have dreamed to ever happen in our lives. But um, been able to go and be a part of things that was just amazing. But I tell them all the time, I said, people want to look at it like that. Ja- Jason never gave me anything. Jason gave it to the Lord. He was being obedient to Him. What He done for me was led me like we're supposed to, like a difference maker would do. The Lord led him. Jason just listened and had okay and yes on his lips. Yeah, Lord, I'll take care of this. I know this man and I got this, you know. And what he's done for me and my family, what he done for me, um, is he led me to the greatest thing I've ever known. The greatest gift that was ever given to me was salvation. The greatest gift. I'm talking about when you hear me talk about being blessed, I'm a blessed man. It ain't got a thing to do with a dollar. He takes care of that too, but that's not that. It's not about that. All my blessings has come from salvation. When I surrendered, it changed my whole world, my whole life, and then I knew what I didn't know right then. Let me back up because I didn't go I went on. I had to come home and ask my wife to forgive me. I said, because I wasn't the best husband in the world, best dad. I loved them all, but I wasn't the best. And I asked her to forgive me for my shortcomings, and I said I wasn't ready for her answer. I wasn't. I expected to get a trashing a you know fussing at, I guess, or whatever. But she didn't do that. She looked at me when I asked her to forgive me, and she looked at me and she said, "I already have." I thought, "Oh my gosh, I deserved everything but that." And I learned in that after that she was doing it two things there. One was the forgiveness for me because she had to for her, and because she lives that kind of life and walks that kind of walk that is an example setter for everybody, and she couldn't go on and have any kind of a hard feeling or a ill will at me, um, even though she had a right to, she didn't, and that was a choice, and she chose to love me, and to this day, I'm still humbled and thankful for that. She had the keys to our family, and she held it together, and thank God for that. Um, that's the second greatest thing. Salvation first, and her forgiveness was second. Um, the third one comes along. The third thing in that is I, there's joy and peace. I was happy. Don't get me wrong. I was happy, and I felt forgiven, and I felt different. My vocabulary changed. My mannerisms had changed. My desires had changed as far as things I were doing and things I place I wanted to go. And so, this was several months later. Um, Things were different. I loved being in the position and where I was at and what the Lord was doing. But there's two things in that I didn't have. And we talked a little bit last night on this on the when I was doing the introduction to this thing. When it's talking about the fruit of the spirit, it's not plural, it's singular. But when you not understand all that, we end up trying to operate in them as a plural. I mean, as a plural. And I had some of the stuff, the kindness had come along, my gentleness and all that kind of stuff. It came along and was doing, you know, he was working on me. Sanctification was in the process and it was working. But what I didn't have and I was missing was joy and peace. And to be truly what we're supposed to be. And if you really want to be a difference maker to people, and be a difference to your community and your church and the people around you, you got to be able to walk in and work in the spirit. You got to work in those fruit in the fruit because you got to have those things, and they work hand in hand. They're not. You can't operate without without one of them because it don't work. They lean on one another, and that's the reason for that. And anyway, but I talked to Dana about it. I just sat down one day. I said, there's something wrong. I said, I don't have the peace and the joy in my heart that I have the love and I have the I love what but I still don't have that true inner peace that I would have thought I would have had. And am I overthinking this and stuff like that? And she said, no, no. There's things that, just pray about and she's right. And so I go to church and I'm not gonna go into depth about that, but there was a situation at church that was an exercise that the preacher wanted to do and we did it and it says in there that he said if there's something that he said everybody close their eyes and so we close them and he said if there's something that you can see on the back of your eyelids, somebody that you haven't forgiven or something, a situation that you have just really still upset with, and you can see that. He said, you need to be in this altar. And I won't go into the detail, but I could see it. And I got up and I hit that altar and I started praying for that situation. And I wasn't there long until I realized that I couldn't pray for that because I didn't have everything else right. I'm thinking, Lord, I don't know. And it instantly hit me, that I had never learned to forgive myself from my past and my shortcomings because I had them. I mean, wasn't that I was a bad person or like that. I don't have that kind of history, I wasn't a robber and a thief and all these kind of things. I wasn't anything like that. I wasn't the man, the dad, and the father and the husband I should have been, and and sure wasn't the man of God I should have been, and I just really struggled with that, and I struggled with the accepting me. Um, I just didn't feel worthy. And that day, instead of that situation that I was talking about praying, I ended up, Lord, I prayed and asking the Lord to forgive me so I'd learn how to forgive myself. And Lord, help me with that. Now, and it's a lot of that goes along with, our salvation and the things that we do are a daily walk. When he talks about this is a daily thing. This is not something that's a one and done thing. You can't do this one time and if you can, you're amazing. Because it's a daily walk. There's gonna be people that's gonna flick you off in traffic or holler at you. I hate people blow a horn at me. It can get me stirred up. But I'm saying is there's things that can happen that can cause us to get out of character for a little bit, and you have to step it back. Whoa, 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 wait a minute. You know, that's the stuff I'm talking about. And that day, I learned that what was causing me that was robbing my joy and my peace was my own self, my own problem with not forgiving my past. The Lord forgave me. Dana forgave me. My family, everything was good there. It was me. And so that doesn't mean I don't have a past. It doesn't mean it ain't still back there. And there's people who love to bring it up, and Satan does every chance he can. Um, it's back there, and it's ugly, and I ain't proud of it, but I'm forgiven. And with that, I gotta stand on that, and it's under the blood, and that's where it's gonna stay, and that's a choice. That's my choice, and it's your choice, and that's the way I see it, and that's the way I believe it, and that's the way that I live it, and stuff. So that's just a brief overview of my testimony. Well, most of it, but there's a lot more in there that we'll get into with other things and different stories about travels and things that we've done and where the Lord's led and the people He's put in our lives. I'll get into all that from there, but man, He has opened doors and open opportunities and conversations and growing, feeding the word, something you need, and all. If you'll hang on, if you got something that you're battling, I'm just going to be honest right here with you and talk to you just one on one for just a second. If there's something you're battling with, you give it to Him. You pray to Him directly, Be just as plain as we're talking right here, and give it to him and say, Lord, I need to see you work in this. I need to see the answer of this because I need my faith restored to that point. That Lord, I need it because I'm weak right now. And I'm going through this situation and I can't go through this alone. And you promised that I wouldn't have to. And if you'll do that and be sincere, hang on. I promise you with everything within me, he'll show himself to you. He'll show himself worthy. He'll show himself faithful. He'll do the trust. I'm telling you, he'll show himself. It may not be the answer that you're looking for. And it may not be the answer that you would have picked, but it'll be the right one because it'll be his. And then he'll show it to you and you'll see it as broad as a wall. Say, God, there you are. Right there it is. You got to be looking for it. You can't just do that and then haphazardly walk on and not go back and look for your answer and then start saying, wow, he never answered my prayer. What did you go back and look for it? Did you ever actually seek out the answer? Most of us say no. I was guilty of that. So that's just kind of a personal side note of that, but it's true, and he will show himself. And I promise you, if you're struggling, get that personal relationship with him. Find whatever it takes, do whatever it takes to get that where you can get personal with him and you, because that's the difference making. That is what causes this smile to be on this face every day. That don't mean that I don't have things that happens and stuff, but it does happen. But anyway, my phone rang. I'm sorry, but I'll answer it back. But I, I just want you to know I love y'all. I love this opportunity with this podcast. I hope y'all getting something out of it. I know it's kind of lengthy here. I told you the other night that when I do my testimony, it's going to be a little lengthy, and I didn't. And I've done it brief tonight. My son, I'm gonna say this, and then I'm gonna get out of here. But my son one time got asked to speak at a church, and they asked my son to introduce me, and and Sean gets up there and he said, I got this privilege of introducing my dad to talk and tonight, and I just got to tell y'all, he said, my dad is the only man I know that's got a 4.5 hour testimony. And you could hear the grunts and the uh-ohs all over the church, and I couldn't get up there quick enough, and I get up there and get over that microphone. I said, "Whoa, wait a minute now." I said, "It may be 4.5 hours, but I promise you I ain't gonna keep you 4.5 hours." I said, I'll make it good and brief here, as best I can." But I said, "In all reality," and I'm gonna tell y'all the same thing, "In all reality," I said, 4.5 hours won't do what he's done for me. I couldn't tell you the goodness of what he's done for me in 4.5 hours. It's gonna take me the rest of my life because and as we see this podcast, he's still doing it today, so it doesn't stop, and 4.5 hours won't do it. So, I have to just be real careful. Dana's all the time telling me, "You're too long-winded, you get carried away." I said, "Well, it's in the details. You really wanna see the difference in my life, and I can't just make it broad. Because it's not broad, it's in the details. He's in the details of everything if you'll look for it. And that's how that relationship grows, is when you start looking down there for him. And he feeds you down there. And I'm thankful for that. And so now that I'm retired and I have a little more time, I can go to the grocery store and stand around and I love that. But you know what? Even if I wasn't, I'd still do it. I still look for these moments because I love it. Ain't nothing like talking about the Lord and how good He is, and all these different chances of opportunities that I've had and getting to talk to people and them coming to me. And I love it the fact that people have comfort. They're comfortable enough to come up and say things to me and talk to me and ask me questions or my opinion and this and that. And I love that. It's an honor actually, and I take it that way, and I'm thankful for it. And I hope I never let you down with that. I hope I answer the questions the best I know how. And if I don't have the answer, I promise you I'll pray about it and we'll seek it out and we'll do what the word tells us to do. That's what we're going to do. So anyway, I just want all of you to know that I love you and this podcast here again, it was my testimony tonight, but it may be somebody else's tomorrow or the next time we do this. And I just been burning to get this out. It's just been like a hunger in me to and now that we've got this all set up, it's like, I want to do this every day. but I don't want to bore all you to death, and I know that it could, and I don't want to be like that. That's not. I want it to be exciting and feeding, and I want to hear your input to it, and I want to hear other people's stories, and I want it to be between others, and because it can't be all my words all the time because it would get boring to you. But uh, promise you that we're going to be praying, and got some other things coming up that I'm gonna talk to you about. Gonna have some people in. Uh, we got Kyle Morrow that's with Straight Creek Church of God. Gonna be sitting down with him and talking about the heritage of the church and things of that nature and where the church as a whole is kind of at today. And then I think we probably will talk a little politics and who knows, and because I'm not real happy uh with things, a lot of different things. I don't like the line of and the deceitfulness of big politics and stuff like that. So we talk about that a little bit and how they make people the false belief and all this uh, stealing and y'all know. We'll get into that later, but anyway, me and him will talk about some of those things and share them, and I'd like to hear y'all's opinions about all that. Um, And then where the church is at. I like the fact that that, he has that prayer conference up there now that in any kind of major decision, the president we have now has a crew of people come in and praying, and I like that. That's a good thing, and, because you can't pray enough. You can't anyway, I like that. So, things that we'll be praying for Israel and for all that to be straightened out. We'll be praying for the Ukraine and Russia, Lord have mercy, that needs to be stopped, and all this stuff. But it's all this is just leading up to times, and we all know that nobody knows the hour of the days or nothing like that. But you can start sure enough see signs and things of unrest and things like that, and still going to find a way to enjoy today. And maybe this will be the day that he steps out on the cloud and blows that trumpet, and if it is, it'll be just fine. It'd be great, actually. But if it ain't, we're gonna make it through the day because we got each other and we're gonna lean on each other and stuff. So anyway, but here again, I want to tell you I love you and I appreciate you and appreciate you tuning into this. And I was overwhelmed at that first day of how many people joined up through it. I was excited about that number. I told Dana, I said, I don't know, maybe 5 people listen to us, but I was overwhelmed with the number that came out to begin with, and who knows, when you put this in God's hand, it's not in mine. So whatever He wants to do with it, wherever it goes, I'm all about it, because it's all for all of us. It's not about personally me personally. I just said yes, and I'm going to continue doing that because I found that that's the way He wants us to do. When it's right and you've prayed and he asks you to do something, be willing to do it, but you got to make sure it's him. Don't do it and because if it's you, it'll fall on his face and you'll fall on your face and don't want to do that. So stay in his will. So anyway, I love you and we'll be back in touch again. So see you soon. Okay. I love you. Bye.